Oh, so we meet again. All right. This time we're on chapter 6, risk evaluation. Without further ado, let's get her going. Introduction. The ultimate purpose of risk assessment is to gain understanding of a risk's nature, its causes, potential severity of impacts, and likelihood of occurrence, and to determine whether additional controls are necessary so that it is acceptable to the organization and to society. Risk evaluation is the act of reviewing the risk-based information developed from the hazard identification and risk analysis and comparing that risk level against the organization's established risk criteria to determine acceptability. The risk management process for the ISO 31000 risk management standard is shown to the right. So there we are on risk evaluation, which out of the three parts of risk assessment, identification, analysis, and evaluation, it's the last one of the risk assessment bundle. You can see in there. So and you can see risk assessment is comprised of three sequential phases: risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. Once a risk has been identified and analyzed and its level has been estimated, a decision must be made regarding its acceptability or need for treatment. They said its level has been estimated because most of these things, even the severity and the likelihood, are somewhat estimates. So you can never get exactly the severity, likelihood, or the risk level exact. It's an estimate. So risk evaluation involves comparing the estimated risk level from the analysis to the organization's established risk criteria, as well as ranking and prioritizing risks within the organization's recorded risks and determining whether the estimated risk is acceptable or risk reduction measures are required. This module will review the concept of evaluating risk and discuss several methods and selected tools that are available to the occupational safety and health professional. Let's be on the end of that. All right. Risk evaluation of the ISO 31000 risk management standards. Risk assessment techniques. Risk evaluation is the process of comparing estimated risk levels with an established baseline, the defined risk criteria in context of the assessment to determine the appropriate action. Remember, the context was the very first step of this whole thing. We define the context. Risk is evaluated using estimated risk levels of consequences and likelihood of occurrence developed in the hazard risk identification and risk analysis phases. The understanding of the nature and magnitude of risk derived from the risk analysis is used to decide whether a particular risk is acceptable and what future actions are required. Methods for defining a risk criteria can range from simple two risk categories, such as those requiring treatment and those that do not require treatment, to more complex methods using multiple risk levels with graduated degrees of actions. ISO 31010 presents a simple concept of dividing risks into three bands used in evaluating risk. These categories can be described as follows: unacceptable, where the activity is to be avoided or reduced before continuing; marginal or ALARP, which is as low as reasonably practicable, where the costs and benefits of further risk treatment are evaluated before continuing; and acceptable, where the risk level is considered negligible, requiring no further risk treatment. Risk evaluation and the ISO 31000 risk management standards continued here. Example of dividing risk into three bands used in evaluating risk. Now I know they say three bands and then they give you four numbers. Go figure, huh? But unacceptable risk, immediate action required, operation not permissible except in rare and extraordinary circumstances. And you can better believe if the plant's running and that particular operation is critical to plant operations, you're going to have to find some very extraordinary circumstances to keep that thing going. You have to do something. ALARP, which is they're kind of calling that the middle, as low as reasonably practical. They're calling the three remedial actions be given high priority and two remedial actions to be taken at appropriate time, but they're throwing that both under that middle band. So that's a little confusing and unnecessary in my opinion. And then one, the very low risk remedial action is discretionary. Procedures are to be in place to ensure risk levels maintained. In a lot of cases when it's like that, if there's something you can do that's quick and cheap, you'll do it. But if it's something that's going to be more extensive at that level, you probably aren't going to do anything at least at now. Maybe later on you will. So risk evaluation, many organizations use risk assessment matrices or heat maps based on defined risk criteria to visually compare risk levels within the graduated risk level categories. And those are some examples. There's your 5x4 up there. And that's another one. So what's that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6x5. So, and that's some of the listings on there. So there's all kind of different ones out there. And so, like I said, my favorite is kind of the 5x5 that we introduced at the beginning of this course, because it has, not only does it have 5 and 5, which gives you, I think, a little more choices than a 4x4, obviously, but also it has 3 columns to the left, one for different things, for damage to property, environment, and people. So I like that in that one. But again, you can use whatever your organization decides to use. The ANSI Z590.3 PTD, which is Prevention Through Design Standards Approach to Risk Assessment, follows the basic concepts found in ISO 931000. However, from an OSH perspective, risk assessment includes the sequential steps of hazard identification, hazard and risk analysis, and risk evaluation. However, the ANSI Z590.3 risk assessment model differs slightly with several additional steps as illustrated in the next slide. So there you go. This is the ISO 31000 on the left and the ANSI on the right. And you can see the ANSI just has some more steps, but it's really not that much difficult. I mean, that much different. And we'll look at those 12 steps in that one too. Excuse me. Gather data. Available data and information gathered on the task, existing hazards and causes, OSHA logs and workers' compensation files. And that's not what it says in the book. I think in the book it says historical data or something like that. Well, guess where you're going to find historical data? In your OSHA logs, workers' compensation files. So existing risk control or prevention measures. You may have historical data if your organization is good at doing near miss reports. That'd be very valuable. But most places aren't very good at it. Most people think no harm, no foul, but they should be investigated. But it's hard to get people to do that when nobody gets hurt. So when you talk about gathering data, and they say throughout this course, they always say, history and that type of thing, that what they mean is OSHA logs and worker compensation files. Set the scope. Establish the context for the risk assessment by defining the purpose, scope, and target of the assessment, as well as its limits and boundaries, schedule, methods, and resources. In other words, are we going to do the whole plant? Or are we going to do line 1? Or are we going to do job 3 of line 1, or whatever you're going to do? Establish the team. Select team members and facilitators or leader, and define their roles and responsibilities. Identify tasks and hazards. Using the hazard risk identification tools selected, identify the document the tasks, hazards, and existing control measures. Analyze the initial risk. Consider existing controls to produce an initial risk score. Existing controls are tested and verified as to the effectiveness and reliability. And don't forget that. When you have controls in place, don't ever consider them to be the absolute. Excuse me, I gotta shut my phone off. And so as part of your job as a safety professional, you should have a program in place to periodically check all controls. It may be a visual for some of them, but too many times I have seen controls bypassed, particularly interlocks. They like to take the interlocks off. I've seen that all the time. So check on those. Evaluate initial risk. Determine if existing controls are adequate for the risk level. Select additional risk reduction measures using the hierarchy of controls until an acceptable risk level is achieved. Make sure my phone's off. Analyze residual risk. A second risk analysis is performed to assess residual risk, which produces a residual risk score. Excuse me. Residual risk is defined as the risk level remaining after risk treatment. Evaluate the residual risk. Determine whether it's acceptable or if it requires reevaluation. If residual risk is unacceptable, the task or operation is halted and returned to step 4 of the process for immediate reassessment and treatment. For those risks that remain unacceptable, the activity is discontinued or in emergency situations, temporarily allowed under careful monitoring and approval of management. If that ever happens, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the people in the safety department to get that thing going, keep that operation going. And which means you're going to have to go back and look at it again, maybe have some temporary actions that might be expensive in the short run to make it more, make it safer, temporary controls, or there's a lot of things you can do, and each situation is different. So I think I told you one time, we're setting up a new piece of equipment in Florida, and I was down there. I wasn't down there particularly for that, but they were doing it. And these things are in fiber processing. It's more of an art than a science, and getting it to do what you want it to do is not always easy. And they were having one heck of a time. But there were some pulleys and gears that were pretty close to where the operators people had to go, and then the guard hadn't been built for them yet. It was being built on it by an outside contractor, and so I kind of went head to head with the people in production, and we agreed to at least put up a temporary guard. We actually made a guard out of cardboard and duct tape, but put it over to these moving parts. So was it perfect? No, but it was something we put in place to make it safer than it was, so we could keep this operation going. And that's the type of thing I'm talking about. Results documented. The findings are documented to track and manage the organization's risks. Evaluation completed. Following the risk assessment and treatment and a determination that the residual risk is acceptable, the evaluation is complete. You think that'll be the end of this, but no. Controls measurement system. All control measures are continually evaluated, tested, and verified to ensure that they remain effective and reliable. If conditions of controls change and a hazard is modified or introduced, the task and hazard are reassessed. This is an important step. And again, even though this is considered like the step 11 of this process, it's an ongoing step. You're always doing this. It's part of your the safety department. Anytime you walk around, you're looking at these things, and you probably know maybe you had a hand in them being put in place. So, excuse me again. So when you see these things, you're going to make sure that they work, and there should be a formal process to do that too. But sometimes your informal process of walking around checking them is adequate too. And then always new hazards. As conditions change, and they will, new equipment or materials are introduced and incidents occur. New hazards are sometimes identified, and a new task or hazard is placed into the risk assessment process. Prevention through design and risk evaluation. The final step in risk assessment is to decide whether to accept the risk as is or require further risk reduction or risk treatment. This decision must be made at the appropriate level of authority. In certain situations, high risk may be temporarily accepted by management with a risk treatment plan in place. In all cases, the residual risks should be documented and clearly communicated to responsible parties, affected stakeholders, and decision makers. Evaluating risk and risk-based decision making using the defined risk criteria and results of the risk analysis, an evaluation of the risk is performed. The evaluation process involves comparing the estimated risk level with the organization's established acceptable risk level to determine if the risk is acceptable and prioritizing actions for those risks that are not acceptable. After risk treatment, the risk is again evaluated to determine if it is acceptable. So you can see the point. You have your process and the risks that are there, and you do your risk analysis. You come up with a risk RPN, a risk number, whatever you want to call it. And if that's acceptable, low enough to be accepted, then fine. But if it's not, then you need to do something else. But even if you do that, you still have to, if you do anything else, you have to do another risk assessment if you do anything out of control. Considerations in evaluating risk should include the following as identified at ANSI ISIS so-and-so risk assessment standard. The objectives of the project, both tangible and intangible effects, legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements, critical control points, tolerability of risks to external stakeholders or society, whether a risk needs treatment, deciding whether a risk is acceptable, deciding whether an activity should continue, selecting priorities for treatment. For risks that are deemed unacceptable, a decision to immediately stop and discontinue the operation or process until the risk is reduced to a acceptable level acceptable to the organization. And again, if this happens, this is going to be pretty serious. You're going to have to do something about it. So, but they're talking about the risk-based decision making here. Identify the decision, determine the context, decision makers, stakeholders, options, and influential factors. Assess risk, determine needs, select RA tools, generate information, make decision, evaluate information, assess options, select option based on risk, and monitor the effectiveness, evaluate results, assess impact, make refinements, and communicate results. The goal of making risk-based decisions is to reduce risk as much as possible. Duh. In certain cases, the risk is judged acceptable, while in others, the risk level must be reduced to become acceptable. The risk-based information generated during the risk analysis is evaluated to determine whether the risk level is acceptable acceptable with further risk reduction, or unacceptable until further risk reduction is reduced to an acceptable level. For risks that are considered acceptable with required further risk reduction, a risk ranking is performed to prioritize risk treatment. For risks that are deemed unacceptable, a decision is made to immediately stop and discontinue the operation or process until the risk is reduced to a level that is acceptable to the organization. The decision to proceed or to stop work is critical and carries with it a great deal of responsibility and accountability. So make sure if you're ever put in this position, you may well be, and the decision is made to proceed with an operation that is deemed unacceptable risk, that the upper management knows about it and well aware of the risk and the potential consequences. They won't like to hear it. They need to know it. Risk can be evaluated using a variety of tools, some of which are covered in this chapter. ISO 31010 lists the number of techniques ranging in application, complexity, and ease of use. Figure 6.8, next slide, illustrates several methods for risk evaluation, as well as Table 6.1, slide after next. There's some risk evaluation methods on their side: ALARP, ALARA, cost and sequence analysis, consequence likelihood matrix, risk heat map, risk indices, risk matrices. There are much of these. Some of those, like a likelihood matrix, risk heat map, indices, matrices. They're really not much different. And then this is some more methods used to evaluate risk. Consequence likelihood matrix compares individual risks by selecting a consequence likelihood pair and displaying them on a matrix with consequence on one axis, likelihood on the other. Duh, where have we heard it before? All right, I'll let you look at these. I'm not going to read them all. Heat map is really the same thing as the risk matrix. So these aren't real different, most of them. So that's the end of part 1 of this presentation. That wasn't too long. Again, I like to make the presentations in 2 parts if they get to be more than 15-20 minutes each, so you'll get tired of hearing my voice and decide to jump off the nearest bridge. So I'm just kidding about that, by the way. So anyhow, that's it for this one, and in the meantime, be safe.